Western politicos, military and mass media have now talked up deliberate gamma-ray-emitting environmental contamination into an okay thing to do. Bruce Charlton. Beginning with the Fire Nation conflict, and now in the Middle East, it has become an okay thing for Western forces deliberately to try and contaminate the environment with gamma-alpha-beta emitting substances. There have already, seemingly, been Western forces launching multiple and sustained missile, and other military, attacks on, what is supposed to be, Europe's largest electricity-generating power station that uses gamma-ray-emitting materials. Compare this with the green outrage over the 1986 power station accident in the same part of the world. There was also reported the massive usage of artillery Mucky missiles, which inevitably polluted the very nation that the West was using as a proxy against the FN, as would the power station attacks have done, if they succeeded. There were and are evidenced claims of Western proxies, with Western help, developing Mucky mines, devices explicitly designed to cause lasting mutation-inducing pollution over a wide area. And just now there are triumphant claims of having destroyed research and development facilities in Zoroastria, which, if true, would inevitably mean extreme and lasting environmental damage from spread of these substances. My point is not so much about what has actually been done, which is unclear, but how this discourse has normalized the idea of deliberately causing, strategic, lasting and dangerous contamination and pollution, and of a kind that has for the previous 80 years, been regarded as the ultimate environmental horror that humanity ought to avoid. We have already reached a point where people do not even notice that this is the intent and consequence of multiple and repeated, and planned, West-initiated, actions. The nature-harming implications apparently do not even occur to the mass of concerned, self-identified responsible, people who affect passionate environmentalism, pseudo-worship of Gaia, who support green parties and policies. This kind of stuff is beyond ridicule, a bizarro inverted world where people are terrified of, and try to eliminate carbon, trademark, the gas of life, yet cool and approving about spreading gamma-alpha-beta emitters across and into our planet on a whim, from military expediency, indeed, simply because it make a good headline. Note, all the above is hard to explain on the basis of politics based on a primary desire for money and power. But it is easily understandable on the basis that Western geopolitics is dominated by those who serve the agenda of Sorothic demons, in other words, those who seek maximal destruction of divine creation as their ultimate goal. The deep archetypes of King Arthur and the Knights, Robin Hood, and Merlin. Bruce Charlton. What follows is either a deep archetypal insight, or more likely just my headcanon, concerning some subjects I have spent an inordinate amount of time reading and thinking about. While I love the big picture, I have always had some reservations about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, perhaps because of their deployment by the Plantagenet and Tudor aristocracy in a self-justifying, self-aggrandizing, sort of way. I mean, when all is said and done, Arthur is a king, and they're all knights. And the stories are often, at least superficially, about fighting on horseback, ransoms, castles, hunting, courtly love, points of honor, and other such nasty or ridiculous, and typically Norman, stuff. To complement this as any kind of myth for England, and the English, it is necessary to give primacy to Robin Hood and his merry men. These represent to me something like the yeomanry and craftsmen of the English and Welsh, Saxons and Celts. Certainly there was, for many generations, a kind of obsession, an insatiable hunger, among ordinary English people for songs and tales of Robin Hood. This archetype is, however, rather poisoned by the gentrification of making Robin an earl, and having the story rotate around his supposed loyalty and obedience to his feudal monarch King Richard I, Lionheart, who was a pretty typical absentee Francophile militaristic Norman oppressor. I see Robin and company's outlawry as, negatively, a protest against the Norman yoke and especially the vile forest laws imposed on the Anglo-Saxons, but positively as a kind of restoration of the freedom and animism of a hunter-gatherer life. The other great archetypal character is Merlin the wizard, whose greatest resonance is as a kind of shaman priest, and a link between the pagan and Christian. I suppose Merlin to have spent most of his time in the forest, nearby the merry men, in my mind replacing Friar Tuck in the role of spiritual teacher, advisor, seer, and magician. But, linking the worlds of Arthur and Robin, Merlin might reasonably have been supposed to spend some time in the court, including the crucial task of arranging the birth of Arthur from suitable hereditary stock, on the basis that, since we apparently must have a king and knights, these might as well be good ones. Spiritual systems, such as churches, used to be net helpful, but now block spiritual contact. Bruce Charlton. We live in a world of systems, of interlinked formal institutions, organizations, corporations, etc., so this is a fact of life. Inevitable, at least at present. But these modern systems, or indeed the overall system, is scientistic, physicalist, materialist in its assumptions, and leaves out the reality of the spirit at the level of our thinking. Systems thinking just is mundane in its nature, and mundane thinking has no space for God or Jesus Christ, except falsely, as supposed means to materialist and this worldly ends. This means that what would have been regarded in the past as spiritual, supernatural, divine knowledge and experiences, are nowadays excluded. The world of spirit is not noticed, or it is explained away as the product of immaturity, stupidity, gullibility, manipulations and lying, or mental illness. In the past it was accepted that religion meant a church, and church meant a system, by which the spiritual was achieved. The church was very complex, and consisted of approved knowledge, facts and interpretations, and narrative, symbolism, and rituals, etc. Each Christian got from his church a strategy for life, almost a blueprint. What to do and what to expect from doing it. There was a plan, methods, and procedures, a causality of do this, and that will be the result. A church was a spiritual system. But men changed, human consciousness changed, and the world changed. From the later 1700s in England and Germany, people began to notice, church systems had ceased to lead to the spirit, the cause and effect of do this and get that was broken. And this experience, or insight, or reality, spread throughout the West, and the world. And, from this point, the system of a church would overall and normally serve to block spiritual contact and experiences, instead of helping them. Because the churches maintained all or most of their canonical information, procedures and interpretations, but these had lost their positive and beneficial effect of leading to the spirit. Leaving, increasingly, empty forms and structures and actions, that were nonetheless asserted to be essential. Instead of providing a plan of action leading to the spirit, the churches inevitably, by their nature as social institutions, retained a predetermined, objectified, materialist framework, into which all possible individual spiritual experience must be slotted. And having been slotted into the already existing church system, spiritual experience was thereby linked with the other social systems, politics, law, economics, science, etc., which total system explained it away as not really real, perhaps with the church added spin of being due to some sin such as spiritual pride, disobedience, etc. By their very existence as social institutions and therefore, necessarily, part of the system, aka globalist, leftist, totalitarianism, the Christian churches went from, often, doing net spiritual good, to constituting a barrier, perhaps a blockage, to the individual Christian's ability directly to experience spiritual reality. So long as modern men remain primarily committed to system, God cannot get at us. Because whatever God does to contact or guide us, we can, and usually will, explain it away. And the churches are complicit in this reality distortion. Of course, the churches often assert that outside their walls lies chaos at best, and unopposed demonic control as most likely. Yet all of these are within the walls of the churches, and often dominant, operating at the level of what makes any church an institution in the world as it now is. The churches are on average and predominantly this worldly in orientation, and mundane in discourse. The spirit is allowed only if confined to predetermined slots in a dysfunctional, because no longer spiritual, system. Christians must therefore, and I think the must is justified, have faith that God can and will operate out with churches and by a direct and personal relationship with each Christian. So long as God is honestly sought. And have faith that Jesus Christ's gift of resurrected eternal heavenly life is available to every person who genuinely desires and actively seeks it, ultimately, regardless of human institutions, and of the circumstances of mortal life on earth. We should have faith, confirmable by personal spiritual knowledge, that God the Creator, our loving Father, will have set up the world so that salvation is available and possible always and everywhere, and for everybody. God works primarily with individual persons, and always has done, thus God merely makes the best of man-made groupings, such as civilizations, nations, religions, churches. Bruce Charlton. It suddenly seems obvious that God has always worked primarily with and by individual persons, and that the historical necessity by which men came to regard divine providence and plans in terms of tribes and nations and churches was partly a spiritual fact and partly a psychological constraint. In other words, men of the past experienced the world and themselves, spontaneously, often unconsciously, as part of a group consciousness. And reality was experienced, psychologically, as oneself being primarily a group member, whose primary role in life was to serve the group. In sum, the group came first, individuality was dependent on the group. Individuality was hard for such people even to conceptualize, but insofar as it was conceptualized, individuality was spiritually regarded as a sin, and psychologically as a menace to society. But man's consciousness has changed since ancient times, and so has his psychology. Now that the spiritual group mind has substantially dwindled and weakened to a level of insufficiency, and now that man's psychology is substantially autonomous and spontaneously alienated, these have ceased to motivate people strongly. It has at last become clear that God always was working primarily with individual persons, but this fact was obscured by the earlier more pooled nature of consciousness, and the innate needs of psychology. All that stuff about God working through tribes, races, nations, civilizations, and via the primacy of churches and other institutions, we, from our individuality, can now recognize to be merely God making the best of whatever and various human groupings by which men use spontaneously to identify themselves. We now, like it or not, realize that God must either primarily be working through groups with individuals as subordinate and in service to group interests. Or else God relates primarily to individual persons, with groups secondary. There is an exception for groups rooted in mutual personal love, such as some families, marriages, and deep friendships. It seems God is directly concerned by such, when they are real, for the obvious reason that love is the basis of divine creation. Any individual incapable of love or excluding of love, is beyond God's reach. Thus, in summary, God works on that aspect of individual beings which is loving of other individual beings. This means that we now are called upon to drop many habits of thinking about God, providence, destiny and the like. We need to stop thinking of God's will in terms of civilizations, nations, religions, churches, tribes. Instead, we are asked to recognize that these institutions are man-made and man-sustained, and God simply makes the best of them. The future of our souls, and of the world, depends first and foremost on God's relationship with each and every being, including human beings. We should regard our relationship with God in terms of this inter-individual reality, and what helps this relationship, and not psychologically erect a mandatory groupish barrier or buffer zone between ourselves and the divine. And the rest of it, civilizations, nations, religions, churches, tribes, is, ultimately, a distraction and a self-deception. Group primacy is, here and now, a perspective capable of leading us towards evil affiliations, but not towards goodness. Resentment and nobility. William Wildblood. If I were the devil, what sin would I most try to stimulate? What sin would be most spiritually corrupting for those who succumb to it, and most damaging for the integrity of any culture in which it took hold amongst a sufficient number of the people? Resentment is the perfect sin from the demonic point of view because it can be disguised as a virtue, both to the one who holds it, and to the society into which it is introduced. One can clearly see how resentment has undermined the Western world and is causing the West to allow itself to be destroyed. It is not only resentment, of course, because there are many factors at play, but this is a prime driver of the spiritually debased condition of our day. Resentment is behind the push for equality, and equality is the tool used to bring down the West and all it strove for, which was excellence. For equality always does bring down more than it raises up, as it inevitably reduces to the lowest common denominator the standards and culture of any society in which its pernicious influence takes hold. No egalitarian culture strives for nobility of soul, and that is the preeminent spiritual quest for Western man. The very word nobility is meaningless in the egalitarian world, but if I had to pick one word to describe the goal of the spiritual path, that would be it. What is nobility? It is a spiritual condition of dignity, authority, responsibility, sacrifice and love, though love understood in its fiery rather than watery context. Nobility is the sun shining in solitary splendor in the heavens, the light by which everything else sees and to which everything else aspires. It is the fully realized individual soul that is able to express the power and majesty of God. It is Christ on the cross and Christ resurrected. It is that which stands at the top of the hierarchical ladder, and the justification for that ladder which, be it noted, has height but also steps whereby to mount. Climbing is harder than falling, and to be noble is harder than to resent, but the noble soul knows God, whereas the resentful soul has completely lost sight of God. It was resentment that caused Satan's fall, and he uses it to bring us down if he can find anything anti-noble in us which he can stimulate. Therefore, cultivate the noble in your heart and shun the petty. That way you will find the path to the true God, who loves absolutely but is no egalitarian. He is too big for that. An area of genuine supremacy of girl geniuses, spiritualist mediums and psychics of the past 2 centuries. Bruce Charlton. Genius is much commoner in men than women. Indeed, in Charles Murray's historical survey of human accomplishment, English literature was the only one of the subjects surveyed in which women made a strong showing. And, even there, women did not feature among the very highest literary geniuses such as Homer, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, and Goethe. But there is one neglected but culturally highly significant area in which it seems as if women geniuses have been supreme, in terms of ability and influence, and that is as spiritualist mediums and psychics. 1. The Fox sisters, who from 1848 were the origin of spiritualism, which became a global phenomenon for a century, and still persists. There is a spiritualist church within 10 minutes walk of where I write. 2. Madame H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, whose international influence is so vast as to be difficult to calculate, and of extraordinary breadth. For instance, Much of Rudolf Steiner's vast oeuvre derives from theosophy, and it was the Theosophical Society in London that converted a secular-minded Gandhi to Hinduism. 3. Mary Baker Eddy founded Christian Science, which grew very fast and went all around the world in a couple of generations to become extremely widespread at its peak, and, although much diminished, it still continues. There is a Christian Science reading room about a mile from here. 4. Ellen G. White was the prophetess whose insights underpinned the Seventh-day Adventist Church, global in reach and apparently still growing, especially in the Third World. 5. Dion Fortune, who was the leading Christian magical occultist of the 20th century. Her teaching and Fraternity of the Inner Light gave rise to multiple other major magicians and magical societies. Nowadays DF's influence appears to be growing in New Age and neo-pagan media. These 5 women, to which some others could be added, constitute a pretty formidable tally in a short space of time. And the contributions of these women was apparently of a fundamental and foundational, rather than derivative, nature. This also fits with the oft-noticed fact, across several religions and churches, that women are intrinsically more often naturally psychic and mediumistic, and can also, like Dion Fortune, who was not naturally a medium, become psychic by effort and training. It is no coincidence that the currently best known, most beloved English Christian mystic is Lady Julian of Norwich. Although genius is always rare, and in most cultures for most of the time, including our own, now essentially absent, there are, indeed, solid psychological reasons, for example innate personality and intelligence, why genius is overall much more often to be found in men. Despite which, over the past half-century, it has become a rather dodgy academic journalistic pastime to manufacture and fake women geniuses in science and the arts, and culture more generally. This has been attempted even in several fields in which there are 0 women of the first, or even second rank, such as mathematics, and the composition of classical music. Meanwhile, there has been this area in which women really do excel, but which has been ignored. Albeit for fairly obvious reasons, in that their activities seem fake, mad, or wicked both to the outgoing Christian traditionalists and the incoming leftist materialists. Nonetheless, if evaluated by the normal standards of our culture, these women's achievements clearly emerge as both socially significant and distinctively creative, and can then be recognized as products of genius. I am currently reading Charles Williams's 1931 novel, in which there is a very early discussion of the notion of temporal paradoxes, in particular a time loop.
Supposing you willed to return a year, and to be again in those exact conditions, interior and exterior, in which you had been a year ago, why then, either you would have the stone with you or you would not. If you had, you were not the same. If you had not, then how did you return, short of living through the intervening period all over again? Lord Argley shuddered at the possibility. It would be delightful, he thought, to know again the thrill which had gone through him when he had heard of his appointment to the office he held. But to have to go again through all those years of painful appeals, difficult judgments, distressing decisions, which so often meant unhappiness to the innocent, no. Besides, supposing you did. When you reached again this moment you would again return by virtue of the stone, and so forever. An infinite series of repetitions of those same few years, a being compelled to grow no older, a consciousness forbidden to expand or to die.
In his biography of Charles Williams, Greville Lindup suggests that this was the first clear discussion of temporal paradoxes / a time loop in any fiction, and before the much better known examples from classic sci-fi authors, since the subject was first broached by H.G. Wells in The Time Machine, 1895. If correct, this is indeed remarkable, in the sense that Charles Williams is very far from being the kind of author that I would have expected to consider and write about such matters. The most likely reason is that, like so many creative writers of that and later eras, including some of his later friends among the Inkling, C.W. had read and pondered the non-fictional work of J.W. Dunn, whose An Experiment with Time was published in 1927. As someone brought up on Doctor Who, I have certainly had plenty of enjoyment from the fictional possibilities of imagining temporal paradoxes. But my understanding of the apparent fact that these paradoxes were not noticed or discussed until less than 150 years ago, is evidence that they are an artifact of particular modern scientific models of time, especially the idea that time is a dimension, as in the title of Williams's novel, that can be separated from space and mapped like a vector. By my metaphysical understanding, this is just a model, not reality, and time cannot in principle be separated out in this fashion, without causing paradoxes, i.e. incoherence, i.e. self-contradictions. In other words, the contradictions and incoherence are reductio ad absurdum evidence that our assumptions are wrong. My understanding is that the fundamental description of reality is of beings, which are alive, purposive, conscious, self-sustaining etc., and that time is just a way of conceptualizing the linear continuity of beings, that beings exist dynamically. So, I enjoy the mental exercise of temporal paradoxes, and these have often provided good plots for stories, albeit with a great deal of hand-waving in their explanations, but these do not trouble me, any more than I am troubled by trying to predict what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. Or by such verbal tricks as, suppose that I am not really me. Such paradox is a product of abstract and artificially discrete inbuilt assumptions, and these assumptions are arbitrary, abstract, and untrue. The prospect of an infinite series of repetitions of those same few years, a being compelled to grow no older, a consciousness forbidden to expand or to die, is superficially spooky. But we are frightening ourselves with our own false conceptualizations. It may be fun, but it isn't serious. Church faith, or church superstition. Bruce Charlton. If once a person becomes convinced that a church, i.e. his church, is ultimately not an institution but also a divine entity, then there is a faith in the church which, in principle, cannot be refuted by any possible experience or action. With faith, the divine nature of a church is irrefutable. And if such a faith is lacking, then there can be nothing that could happen that would ever prove a church to be divine. In other words, the judgment is contained in the assumptions. Yet the above two faith-focused alternatives do not exhaust the possibilities, because a church may instead be, or become, the object of superstition. Superstition is an interesting and seldom remarked phenomenon, because it does not make sense either to real spirituality or to materialism, yet it is almost universal. A person can be, and innumerable people actually are, highly superstitious, yet in their theoretical understanding of the nature of the world, they reject any possible explanation for having their superstitions. Superstition survives and thrives in this age of science, just as it did in the preceding age of faith, but although powerful, superstition is also uncomfortable. So we can be confident that superstition is not the same phenomenon as religion, nor necessarily a part of religion, also that it is a spontaneous and innate aspect of being human. These by the fact that superstition as a phenomenon has been nigh universally rejected, it was, sometimes, rejected as evil by religion, and currently is, usually, now rejected as non-valid by mainstream leftist materialism. Superstition is therefore disreputable, furtive, and we sense that it probably does us no good even as we feel it personally necessary to yield to its insistent claims. The skeptical materialist explains superstition as a phenomenon of psychology, indeed psychopathology, an irrational symptom of some dysfunctional mental condition. Yet this does not coherently explain why this aspect of psychology survives, and thrives, without the oxygen of societal approval, and in face of ridicule, when so much of human instinct, e.g. in the sexual realm, has been inverted. Superstition is instead perhaps best understood by a follower of Jesus Christ as part of a constellation of extremely durable ideas to do with luck and propitiation. Luck and propitiation are, in turn, bound up with implicit assumptions concerning the incomprehensibility and hostility of supernatural and divine entities. Their ideas have seemingly been integral to past religions. For instance, Roman religion and superstition were so integrated as to be inextricable. Superstition is still very much a part of religion, as is in 2025 and the West, in particular, I would say, in terms of people's attitudes to their church. There is no strong faith in churches, as was evident by church behavior in 2020 and the pandemic, but as is evident in almost everything almost all of the time. Instead, we have superstition about churches. The difference between faith and superstition is the difference between positive and negative. Faith is positive, superstition negative. Faith is expressed by a trust analogous to the young child's trust in his loving parents in a good family. This trust is something like the opposite of superstition. The faith of a Christian is an analogous trust in God, because God loves us personally. Conversely, superstition is rooted in mistrust, and the need for propitiation. The implicit assumptions of superstition is that the world is alive and purposive, which is why materialists cannot explain it, and the world is partly incomprehensible in its motives, hence the attention to luck, and partly hostile. Superstition focuses on the negative harm that may be done to us, if we anger or offend those entities who have power over us. We can't really understand these entities, therefore we sometimes must do things that make no sense to us, yet we fear not to do them, lest this cause offense. Why must we grovel, kneel, prostrate, avoid eye contact? Who knows? But best to do it, to be on the safe side, to avoid offense. Why must we perform superstitious rituals? Same reason. We don't believe in the validity of these rituals, but we do fear not to do them. Why must we make ritual obeisance to church authority? Why refrain from acknowledging personal discernment? Why refuse publicly to acknowledge that we have taken ultimate responsibility for our fundamental convictions? Therefore, superstition is a double negation. It seeks to avoid the harm that may result from antagonizing the world and its entities. People neither believe in nor act upon positive faith in a church and the goodness of God the Creator, yet we double negatively fear to deny the claims of the church and its ultimate and eternal authority over us. After all, somebody might notice, might be listening, and then who knows what may happen. It seems to me that the continuing power of churches over men's minds, especially among Christians, is of this superstitious nature, which is why churches have survived the extreme loss of faith occurring both in church rulers, priesthoods, ministers' leadership, and among church laity/members. Church Christians do not positively and faithfully trust their churches in any strong and durable or primarily motivating way. And churches have almost ceased to be a force for good in the spiritual realm, but instead net support the agenda of totalitarian evil. Yet church Christians fear to antagonize their churches, even mentally, in a way closely analogous to that by which people fear to go against irrational and meaningless superstitions. Church adherence by superstition is thus, like other superstitions, not a product of theory or understanding, but something people do despite their theories, and because of their lack of understanding. One who faithfully believed and trusted in a Creator God who loved us each as his individual children, such an one would have no truck with his own felt needs to propitiate the divine. However motivationally or psychologically powerful, such a desire would be recognized as a sin, because it misrepresents the nature of God and divine creation. Superstition is strong and superstition is wrong, but this is no paradox, and quite normal in our lives and this world. A Christian should know and acknowledge that superstition is an evil, even though he cannot stop feeling it, and even when cannot stop yielding to it. And even when it applies to his church. Superstition should lead to repentance, not to the attempt to justify its necessity. Such is the nature of sin and of human beings in this world. We just are sinners, and cannot cease from sinning, but we can always repent. Therefore, like other superstitions, church Christianity as is in 2025, is primarily a consequence of lack of faith in the personal and loving goodness of God the Creator. And the spiritual harm of church superstition is sustained by the refusal to repent. Note, the above is a harsh teaching, but I believe that it is true. The only way out and up from where we now are, is first to return to unexamined or denied root assumptions, then to acknowledge and evaluate these assumptions, and that is what I am trying to stimulate here. In other words, far too many Christians actually are assuming that God is incomprehensible and unloving, when the reality is very simply that God the Creator is our Father who loves us as His children, and God's motives are understandable as those of ideal parents are confidently known by their offspring. A child ought not to regard genuinely loving parents in a superstitious manner, and to assume that fear is appropriate and propitiation is necessary is a sad and self-harming misunderstanding that actually denigrates love. All I am suggesting is that Christians take seriously, and put first, the teachings and example of Jesus concerning His Father, especially as it is revealed in the fourth Gospel. This teaching on God as an actual and loving parent of us as His children is what is literal, sure and certain about Christianity, above all else. And all else, all other claims of church, theology, philosophy, doctrine, church history etc., needs to be judged by this. Paging Boromir. Anyone who approves of, real or imagined, four-dimensional chess strategies in politics is on the side of evil. Bruce Charlton. There has been, I notice, another and severe outbreak of four-dimensional chess attribution among political commentary in relation to the current US president's foreign policy. I would suggest that politics when it is good is actually very simple. Whenever politics actually is, or aspires to be, complex, nuanced, multifaceted, then we should know that we are confronted with our old friend the Boromir strategy. Under all the rationalizations it's just another case of, hey lads, let's use the One Ring to fight Sauron. It's not that the US president and his gang couldn't or wouldn't play some kind of 4D chess game, but that insofar as they do operate thus, then they objectively are on the side of evil. And those political commentators and analysts who approve such modes of operation are part of the pseudo-alternative, but in fact totalitarian establishment allied, Boromirosphere. They are doing the work of Satan, however they may self-identify or self-present as one of the good guys. Conformity or transformation. Francis Berger. Christianity is, or should be, a transformative religion, in the late 14th century sense of the word, transformum, that is, to alter or change the form of supernaturally. The Latin root trans signifies across or beyond, while formare remains innately comprehensible in the modern use form. What Jesus offers is definitely across or beyond mortal life, and it has everything to do with changing form in that beyond. Those who choose to follow Jesus may experience some transformative effects in mortal life, but the bulk of the transformation occurs in the beyond, after death. Unfortunately, Christianity has become a religion of seeking transformation in mortal life, of disregarding the beyond or across in favor of some alteration in the here and now. Somewhere in Christianity's history, the aim of supernatural, next worldly change gave way to desiring natural changes and improvements in this world in the form of better lives, improved societies, the conquest of social ills, altruism, good citizenship, and all the rest. Changing forms in the beyond quickly became somewhat of an afterthought. Christianity also quickly became a religion of conformity. At first, this conformity centered on obedience to God and complying with His will. However, as the churches rose in temporal and political power, they demanded adherence to doctrines and laws that aimed to make Christians compliant and tractable in this world. The churches taught that the supernatural change in form Jesus offers in the beyond depended exclusively on this worldly conformity to churches. The power and influence that Christianity and its churches enjoyed in this world faded long ago. Contemporary worldly power and politics not only reject transformation in the supernatural, next-worldly sense, but they are positively antagonist toward it. And the churches? Well, the churches now conform almost entirely to that antagonistic worldly power. So, what do Christians conform to when they willingly conform to churches? Christianity is, or should be, a transformative religion rather than a conformative religion. Anyone who argues otherwise is focusing on the wrong form. Is life after death important? C.G. Jung's opinion. Bruce Charlton. Regular readers will know that I regard Christianity to be, in essence, Jesus' offer of resurrected eternal heavenly life to those who follow Him. Yet this is very far from being regarded as the core of Christianity. Indeed, most Christians would disagree, both now and throughout the history of the Christian churches. The idea that we might want/need/expect eternal life after mortal death, especially first and foremost, is something that the modern mind sees as a bad thing, selfish, childish, indeed ridiculous. To the typical modern atheist stoic, a desire or demand for life everlasting is seen as irrational, and a product of psychological deficiencies such as wishful thinking and/or cowardice. It is interesting to consider what C.J. Jung, son of a Protestant pastor, in late life probably a deist rather than theist, and not a Christian, had to say about life after death, writing in the middle 20th century, and in old age.
It is not that I wish we had a life after death. In fact, I would prefer not to foster such ideas. Still, I must state, to give reality its due, that, without my wishing and without my doing anything about it, thoughts of this nature move about within me. I can't say whether these thoughts are true or false, but I do know they are there, and can be given utterance, if I do not repress them out of some prejudice. Prejudice cripples and injures the full phenomenon of psychic life. And I know too little about psychic life to feel that I can set it right out of superior knowledge. I lend an attentive ear to the strange myths of the psyche, and take a careful look at the varied events that come my way, regardless of whether or not they fit in with my theoretical postulates. Unfortunately, the mythic side of man is given short shrift nowadays. He can no longer create fables. As a result, a great deal escapes him, for it is important and salutary to speak also of incomprehensible things. Such talk is like the telling of a good ghost story, as we sit by the fireside and smoke a pipe. What the myths or stories about a life after death really mean, or what kind of reality lies behind them, we certainly do not know. We cannot tell whether they possess any validity beyond their indubitable value as anthropomorphic projections. Rather, we must hold clearly in mind that there is no possible way for us to attain certainty concerning things which pass our understanding. From Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by C.G. Jung.
Jung seems confident that ideas concerning life after death are in the realm of anthropomorphic stories we tell ourselves, and therefore cannot in principle be understood in terms of truth to reality. Nonetheless, Jung feels that there is a psychological reality to life after death, and he personally cannot help but regard an afterlife as something that will happen to him. Such a perspective seems only to have been a genuine possibility as a relatively brief transitional phase, possible only for those who were raised religious, became atheist in adolescence or young adulthood, then came to value psychological, or social, aspects of religion as helpful, or indeed necessary, for an integrated and fulfilling life. In considering what is objectively real and knowable, Jung's perspective makes the same assumptions and exclusions as natural science, therefore its conclusions are inevitable, and Christianity becomes nothing more than a potentially therapeutic fairy tale, something that it may make us feel better, if we believe it. In a word, for Jung, as for many other modern people, religion is, at best, a palliative. He would have said that, for many people, it is good to believe, and by good he meant good for our health and happiness, here and now. This, I think, is what underlies the common assertion, something we heard a lot from Prince/King Charles, for instance, that faith is a good thing, while atheism is, usually a mistake, because it makes many people ill, miserable, dysfunctional. Jung may argue that life after death is important, but its importance is confined to how we are feeling in life before death. Life after death exists as an idea, and its reality relates to the role that ideas have in human functioning. For Jung, this included a collective unconscious that was part of, and accessible to, all humans, and extended through many generations. Yet the nature and value of ideas in the collective unconscious ultimately, and inevitably cashed out in terms of human mortal lives, human happiness or misery, health, social functionality, and the like. Life after death therefore is excluded from any cosmic role, it cannot have anything to do about solving the fundamental problems of existence, the problem of evil, and the problems of entropy, disease, degeneration, death. Life after death by Jung's account can affect what we think about such matters, it is a matter of adjustment to immovable realities, it is a therapeutic understanding of religion. As I said, Jung did not, apparently, seriously identify himself as a Christian, but here are plenty of people who do self-identify as Christian and who have a closely similar understanding of life after death. Word spells in Christian theology, we absolutely need simplicity and clarity concerning what it is to be a Christian. Bruce Charlton. When explanations get complex or highly abstract, they become word spells, and people think a question has been answered when they have actually just been lulled to sleep. This is perhaps why questions asked of witnesses in court, and their answers, need to be short and simple. But this is misleading if the assumptions behind the questions, the assumptions within which the questions arise, are wrong. That's perhaps functionally okay. If it works. But word spells may work only temporarily, or in certain contexts. For instance, the complex and abstract word spells of Trinitarianism were not designed to answer questions, but to stop Christians persecuting and killing each other in the early Christology disputes, by employing a kind of hypnosis. This, more or less, worked. For a while, until the soothing enchantment was broken by the rise of Islam. Which was, I think, substantially rooted in a clear, simple, rational rejection of the literal nonsense of Trinitarian word spelling. Other initially successful examples of word spelling include the crucial areas of the necessity for Jesus Christ, the nature of free will, and the origins of evil, in a world that is defined as the product of an omnipotent and omniscient God who created everything from nothing. The traditional answers to these questions work insofar as they complexify and abstract, until the problem is lost sight of and/or the irrelevance or insufficiency of the answer is lost sight of. But in Christian theology, the traditional word spells clearly do not work anymore, and has not worked for several generations. Word spelling comes with the price that everybody is then asleep or dazed, insofar as they are Christian. Since they are deeply and ineradicably confused and disorientated by the abstractness and complexity of their theology, Christians are not strongly motivated. They are in a state of permanent uncertainty as to what they are supposed to have as their primary priorities and fundamental convictions and desires. Therefore Christians have, by default, become passively assimilated to worldly evil and now Christian churches support the satanic totalitarian agenda, as became explicitly evident in 2020 and since. Any viable answer must include a refusal and rejection of theological word spells, and the inexorable demand for simplicity and clarity concerning what it is to be a Christian, what is entailed by becoming a follower of Jesus. A suitable answer must, like any truthful answer, depend on valid assumptions concerning the nature of reality. But it must also be the kind of short, simple, and concrete answer that would be acceptable in a law court. Note, this post was developed from a comment I made at Francis Berger's blog. Eternal means everlasting, not unchanging. Francis Berger. Eternal does not and cannot mean unchanging because nothing in existence, not even God, has ever been unchanging. I don't care how anyone explains it to me otherwise. A quick look around at the universe is all it takes to demonstrate that it is a place of endless change. Nothing in existence is static. Placing God onto his own timeless, changeless level of existence alters nothing except increase unbelievability. So, yes, God is eternal, but not unchanging. The same applies to us and all other beings. Eternal, but not unchanging. Eternal, in the sense of everlasting and ever-changing. When nobody believes what everybody believes, more on word spells. Bruce Charlton. In response to Francis Berger's comment on word spells in Christian theology. Maybe it's like this. If someone becomes convinced by the usual mainstream modern assumption that truth is objectively located in the external world, truth is out there, and our job is just to perceive and recognize this external truth, then such a person never has to convince himself of truth. He feels more confident of some proposition only secondarily, not inwardly, for example by rereading and reciting it, by propagating and defending it in public discourse. This way of thinking may explain how arguments that cannot really convince, become perpetuated over centuries. It happens because, when truth is out there, reasoning does not even need to convince. Indeed, nobody ever needs personally to be convinced. So we get a world, and this is our actual world, and the world of historical past, where everybody claims/argues and acts like they believe something. Something that, inwardly, literally nobody believes. What blogging should be about, and sometimes is. Bruce Charlton. Last week the secular right bloggers man, who I had been reading regularly for several years, apparently died suddenly of natural causes, and I find that has saddened me more than might be expected. The reason seems related to this strange and recent literary form of blogging, which I have been reading for more than 20 years, and myself doing regularly for 15. In particular to the distinctive relationship that may develop, inwardly, perhaps wholly in imagination, between a blogger and his readers, and vice versa. To read and get something from a blog, it really needs to be a personal thing, either frequent, or else extensive. This is because there needs to be a persona behind the blog, we need to be aware of a person behind the opinions. On the flip side, for a blogger to sustain his work sufficiently, he must himself be motivated by the process of blogging, and by its opportunity for presenting miscellaneous ideas freshly, and without being subject to overview. And, while there obviously must be a significant degree of common interest to keep reading a blog, there need not be any very complete agreement. For instance, several of my long-term favorite bloggers long-term have been Orthodox and traditional Roman Catholics, people such as Binold at the Orthosphere, who I've been reading for a couple of decades. Instead there has to be some kind of basic affinity with the blog persona, but especially with the person we infer behind that persona. I say infer, because we don't need to know much specifically about the blogger in real life, so long as what we do know is honest and unpretentious. I personally find it very irritating/intolerable when bloggers are trying to impress me, especially when they try to stimulate my admiration or envy, no matter what other valuable qualities they have. And there are many such bloggers, and unfortunately their need to brag seems to feed upon itself, and get worse. In other words, we keep reading a blog attentively because, to use an English phrase, we have come to believe that the blogger is basically a good bloke. That is far more important than a close fit of specific convictions or opinions. But, as the pretentiousness/bragging aspects makes clear, bloggers change, and someone we begin liking may evolve into somebody we find intolerable, and so we bail out from readership. Beyond that, because blogging needs to be relatively high volume, interest is maintained by insights, and a good blogger needs to generate plenty of these to sustain attention. Blogging is, I think, mainly a stimulus, rather than a medium for conclusive argument. So, a blogger like Zman kept me reading partly because he had many insights that seemed personal rather than, as with mainstream journalism, merely parroted, and partly because I found what he wrote stimulating. Even though I often disagreed with it both ultimately and superficially, and even though I think his blogging was constrained by the constraint of monetization and pseudonymity, which prevented it from achieving the highest levels of the form. I have come to believe that professional writers very seldom generate first-rate work, although they may produce a large amount of second and third-rank work. Furthermore, I think all the greatest writers did something else, worked some other job, before they wrote their greatest work. Writers who have done nothing but write as adults, never, I think, attain the highest levels. I think readers usually judge a blog by its best, rather than its average level, just so long as the gaps between the good stuff is not too great. So long as we retain our basic liking for the blogger, we don't much mind the duds. And in fact we cannot have the peaks without the troughs, as we see from the history of even the greatest artists. Even so, supreme and natural and artists as Mozart, for instance, continued to produce dud operas and concertos even during his greatest phases of achievement, and right up to his death. To do our best, we must take risks, and when we take risks we shall sometimes or often fail. And we can learn much from acknowledging our failures, but first the failures have to happen. At any rate, blogging benefits from a careless attitude of Fredo, and the ability to shrug off those times when posts don't take off or just don't gel. As an example of a recent example of the kind of blog post I like best, here is, non-famous, blogger Irish papist, with a very personal and honest, free associational development of ideas on the theme, everything comes back to religion. As often said, writing is thinking, or it can be, and here you can sense AP thinking as he writes, and share his excitement at the insights as they emerge from the exploration. I've been sampling Irish papist on and off for several years, long enough to have decided he is a good bloke, and from this assumption I find that he produces a stimulating post every so often, that seems to set off associations and notions in myself. And this perhaps is what good blogging is about, and why regular readers come to care, at least somewhat, about our favorite bloggers, and miss them when they are gone. Love your enemies. William Wildblood. As we know, the devil quotes scripture for his own ends. Nowhere has he been busier in this regard over recent years than with the matter of love, which is now used as an excuse to overlook all manner of assaults on goodness and truth. Don't judge, don't condemn, be tolerant, accept everyone and, pretty much, everything because, you know, love. When Jesus told us to love our enemies, he meant we should not hold hatred in our hearts for those who do us an ill turn. This is not to benefit our enemies who may or may not be good or bad people. It is to stop the hatred corroding our soul, which is what hatred does do when it is personal. He was saying that hatred darkens the heart while love brings light to it. You cannot affect what is out there in others, but you can affect what is in yourself. If you want to go to heaven, then you must have heaven within you. We need to remember this. After death you will go to a place, an environment, that reflects your inner state. The subjective mind and the objective world reflect each other in the post-mortem state, the spiritual world. If you have hatred within you, you cannot go to a place of love. This is why we are enjoined to take Christ into our hearts. Not merely believe in him, but actually build him into our being. This does start with belief but must progress to a form of identification. That does not mean you are Christ, that is blasphemy, but Christ is in you. Controversially for a Christian, this can work with other deity figures depending on how much spiritual light they carry, but none carries so much light, and pure light unmixed with other stuff as is the case with other deity figures, as Christ, who is the image of God in human form to a greater degree than anything or anyone else. God has appeared in many images to humanity at various stages of its existence, but only in Christ is he revealed as fully as is possible in this world. So, love your enemies because love cleanses the soul and hatred makes it sick. But loving your enemies does not mean accepting evil, and if you use the excuse of love to ignore or, worse, justify evil, then you are betraying love, which, ultimately, is love of the good. Today, in the name of love, what is ugly is called beautiful, what is unnatural is called natural, and what denies spirit is regarded as healthy in its own way as what fully accepts it. If you really love, then what you love first and foremost is God, who is the author of love, and if you love God, then you condemn what rejects or insults God. You don't let that condemnation affect you on a personal level, because then it drags you down, but nor do you succumb to the dangerous illusion that universal, unconditional love means loving everything equally. There is good and there is evil. To love your enemy does not mean accepting evil, which must be identified and unsentimentally condemned. Christian truth is not about conforming with being. Francis Berger. Quote, "Maybe it's like this. If someone becomes convinced by the usual mainstream modern assumption that truth is objectively located in the external world, truth is out there, and our job is just to perceive and recognize this external truth, then such a person never has to convince himself of truth. He feels more confident of some proposition only secondarily, not inwardly, for example by rereading and reciting it, by propagating and defending it in public discourse. This way of thinking may explain how arguments that cannot really convince, become perpetuated over centuries. It happens because, when truth is out there, reasoning does not even need to convince. Indeed, nobody ever needs personally to be convinced. So, we get a world, and this is our actual world, and the world of historical past, where everybody claims/argues and acts like they believe something. Something that, inwardly, literally nobody believes." End quote. The above is Bruce Charlton's response to a comment I had left on his recent Word Spells post. It reminded me of some of Nikolai Berdyaev's thoughts on the subject of truth from his Truth and Revelation.
Truth is not something given objectively, but rather a creative achievement. It is creative discovery, rather than the reflected knowledge of an object or a being. Truth is the creative transfiguration of reality.
Like Dr. Charlton, Berdyaev objects to the idea of truth as something that is given objectively. He slow rejects the notion that our main task is recognizing and knowing this truth out there. For Berdyaev, truth was an internal, inward experience flowing from the spirit.
Truth is not objective, ordinary reality, reflected in the knower and entering into him from outside, but rather the enlightenment, the transfiguration of reality. It is the introduction into the world's data of equality, which was not there before truth was revealed and known.
Introducing into the world's data equality which was not there before the truth was revealed is both creative and participative, underscoring how truth is intricately related to co-creation.
Truth is not conformity with what we call being, but rather the kindling of a light within being. I am in darkness and seek the light, I do not yet know truth but I seek it. By this very fact I affirm the existence of truth and light, existence in another sense than the existence of the world's realities. My seeking is already the dawning light, and truth is already beginning to reveal itself.
I have known many Christians who more or less defined Christianity as conformity with being, yet as Bediaf and Dr. Charlton point out, conformity with being very rarely leads to actual belief, let alone faith. Instead of conforming with being, Christians should seek to kindle a light within being. Maybe then we could start really believing in truth rather than simply believing out truth. Instead of conforming to reality, we should begin thinking about transfiguring it. Starting with ourselves, from within. We harm people by treating metaphysical errors with psychological palliatives. Bruce Charlton. There is a very common psychological scenario in which someone is, or feels himself to be, motivated by high goals, then he is given well-meaning advice that addresses mundane concerns. And the consequence is that the high aimer feels misunderstood and alienated. For instance, somebody wants to change jobs or get married, and such risky, and perhaps genuinely misguided, behavior is met by well-meaning pragmatic advice pitched at the level of probabilistic human psychology. Perhaps advice about being cautious, not burning bridges, maybe by describing the kind of adverse scenarios that could be expected to eventuate, and so forth. In this situation, one person is operating at a higher level of aspiration and motivation than the other, and the attempt to drag him down to mundane cautiousness and matters of practical expedience may, quite accurately, be experienced as a profound misunderstanding, and the process leaves the high-aiming one feeling isolated. This is a serious error of discourse. Yet, I'm sure we have all done it, and more than once. Especially because in our society, the mundane is equated with the only real, and high goals seems imaginary and delusional, which indeed they may be. But the point is that even obviously mistaken, imaginary and delusional high aspirations need to be addressed at the same level, or a higher level. We should learn not to try and drag down high aspirations to expedient pragmatism, even when, perhaps especially when, the aspirations are wrong. This situation arises in individual persons and at a societal level. For example, it describes public discourse concerning 1960s counterculture, as it affected many millions of adolescents and young adults. The counterculture included a great deal of manipulation and wishful delusion, and was based on wrong metaphysical assumptions and included many selfish and hedonic intentions. Nonetheless, it operated at a higher than mundane level, a level of idealism. When flaky and naive 60s ideals were met with pragmatic and mundane arguments concerning the real world, and economic necessity, status and security, this was, rightly, experienced as an attack on idealism, and a dragging down of high aspirations to the futility of barnyard materialism. In dealing with high but wrong aims, we ought to eschew the temptation of shooting at the easy mundane targets, and consequently reducing the discourse to a level of mere survival and selfishness. We ought to respect the aspiration for higher things, and sympathize with the instinct to reject mere expediency as the primary guide for life. We need to meet naive idealism on its own level, or above. Note, this point was derived from rereading and considering Chapter 4 of William Arkell's A Geography of Consciousness. Christians are badly mixed up about hope, with evil consequences. Bruce Charlton. It seems to be a hallmark of the dangerous stupidity of most of identified Christians that they translate the injunction to hope, as one of the core virtues, into a kind of dumb optimism about the people and social institutions of 2025. They hope that if they continue to believe, support and obey their leaders, national government, church, science and medicine etc., then this kind of undiscerning process of taking the side of evil and obeying it, on the basis that it might, hopefully, actually be good is a good thing. Good and also necessary because a Christian thing. The reasoning is that if a good thing is not certainly utterly impossible, then Christians ought to believe it, or, at least, say they believe it. Such Christians to spend most of their energies and efforts in lending assistance to evil-affiliated people and institutions, on the grounds that there is always hope. That these might already are secretly good, or good despite everything, or change their minds and become good. Especially if we give them the benefit of the doubt, who knows? It is easy to imagine what Jesus would have said if he had been told to give the benefit of the doubt to the activities of temple money changers, or the Pharisees. So people continue, actively as well as passively, to support Western nations and social institutions, including churches, that once may well have been overall good, but now are quite openly and aggressively untruthful, and pursue value inversion. And all on the basis of what they call hope. This is evil in at least two ways. Firstly, because it supports the strategies of evil institutions in their work of corrupting the world. Secondly, because it corrupts the individual who supports evil institutions. It's my impression that such is one of the most common methods by which individuals, including many individual Christians, get corrupted, and drift into changing sides in the spiritual war of this world. Even worse, they change sides without realizing that they have done so, and therefore they have aligned with evil without repenting. In this world of sin, to do evil, even to support evil, is itself not the most fundamental spiritual problem. Jesus came to save sinners, exactly because we cannot stop sinning. The really serious, indeed lethal, spiritual problem is to do evil without recognizing, acknowledging and repenting that evil. Such Christians have set aside the need to take personal responsibility for their discernments and judgments, and personally to make spiritual choices in this mortal life. Instead, what they actually do, is make more expedient, more socially acceptable, more personally rewarding life choices on the excuse of hope. Which as of 2025 means supporting organizations and groups that are overall explicitly evil in both their aims and methods. The problem with this hope is therefore that it blocks thinking, discernment, judgment and personal responsibility, and dissolves the very purpose and meaning of life. Not good. If not, then what? Christian hope is meant to be something very solid and sure. It is meant to be rooted our firm intention and belief in our own salvation. We ought not to be unsure about this, because the matter is in our own hands. Jesus made it possible, after that, it is our choice. Vague wishful thinking hope has no place in this. We ought to be thinking of salvation in a realistic way. Do we want it? Will we commit to it? But what about other people? In the first place, we have no business hoping for the salvation of people in the mass or in the abstract, people reported in history books, or the mass media, and our feelings are only genuinely Christian when they relate to actual human beings. Indeed, to those whom we love to at least some degree. Bearing in mind that love is interpersonal, between human and other beings. We can and should and do hope for the salvation of those we love, and this is very important. Loving is, indeed, the single most important thing that we can do for them. But this hope is rooted in the fact that the game is not over until it is over. In particular, no matter how deeply enmeshed and engaged in evil, those who currently reject salvation are allowed to change their mind at the very last moment, and perhaps forever. It can be seen that this hope has nothing to do with the necessity for judgment and discernment in this our mortal lives. We can, should and must evaluate other people, organizations, nations, in terms of whether they are good affiliated on the one hand, or else opposed to God and divine creation. We need to make and act upon such judgments. Obviously we do. as Jesus did. And this has absolutely nothing to do with any claim that our judgment is fallible. Of course our judgment is fallible, in this as in everything. If infallibility were required we could never do anything, and neither would we choose to do nothing. To demand infallibility before judgment is incoherent, hence, even for this reason alone, evil. Genuine, strong Christian hope is in fact a product of faith in God, faith in a God who is our loving parents, and who is the Creator. But that is not sufficient, because for hope to be real and for us personally, we need furthermore faith in Jesus Christ who made our salvation, resurrected eternal life in heaven, possible to those who follow him. All genuine hope therefore springs from our personal confidence in our own salvation. So, in this sense, and contrary to mainstream Christian teaching, we ought not merely to hope for our salvation, because it is guaranteed us, if we make the needful commitment to live wholly by love. We should therefore live in sureness of our salvation. And hope? Well, hope is for those we love, and hope is an ultimate aspiration related to their final choice and destination. Hope is not a guide to our behavior in this mortal life. We are born and live as young children with a coherent worldview. Bruce Charlton. It is strange to a modern mind, but makes obvious sense if this is the creation of a good and loving God, that our innate understanding of the world, which we spontaneously experience as young children, often, and ideally, seems to be more coherent than any of the others which come to replace it. In other words, a child's experience and explanation of reality makes sense and hangs together better than mainstream modern materialism, and also better than the complex intellectual structures of religions. However, a vital element of this coherence is the mind of the child, the consciousness of a child, the way he apprehends, experiences, explains the world, which is different from the minds of those who come up with alternative explanations. I have come to regard the young child's understanding as innate because God-given, part of divine creation, which is why it is true, so although different, other forms of understanding, for example among adults, and in various societies, ought to be compatible with those of the child. This innate understanding relates to the pre-Christian world, the not-Christian world, or what I term primary creation, creation without Christ. A loving child in a loving family knows the goodness of God, and that this world is purposive and has meaning is implicit. Reality is personal, a matter of beings not things. And the world works in terms of the relationships between beings, in terms of desires, motives, etc. I don't think young children spontaneously think about creation, rather, they implicitly assume that the world is created by personal intentions. The world doesn't just happen, is not random nor mechanical. But the child also has an implicit understanding of both entropy, change, death, and of evil that sometimes impinges upon goodness and happiness. He realizes there are threatening beings that want to scare and harm him. The child also knows that he is involved in this, that bad things happen in part because of something in himself. For example, it is because he thinks about them or dreams about them, that monsters and other threats are attracted, and may come. It is because he got angry that his favorite toy was smashed, yet he cannot stop himself from thinking/dreaming about monsters, cannot stop himself getting angry, spiteful. This implies a knowledge of evil in himself. The child also realizes that people and things change, and he does and may lose things and people from forgetting, breakages, destruction, theft, removal, death, etc. And also that when these happen, or might happen, the child will also himself have something to do with it. Irresistible, irrevocable change is inside himself, as well as outside. The child's spontaneous answer to these problems would seem to be a wish for invulnerability for himself and those he loves, so that the bad things of the world do not affect him or his life. A wish, 2. To be free from those bad thoughts that attract trouble and misery. This relates to the fascination for heroes, whether divine, demigod, angelic, or superhero. What lies behind this is the idea that we may personally be transformed, while remaining ourselves, such that the bad things of life do not affect us personally, or those we love. If this were to happen, then we could live in the world without fear of pain, harm or loss, and this I believe is a daydream hope of young children. So far this is negative, but a child aspires to the positive as well. Especially if we recognize that a child spontaneously knows that the material is always spiritual, and nothing is neutral, all has meaning and relates to purpose. For a child, everything is personal and relational, and everything has resonance and depth and is important, nothing is mundane or trivial. Children's play and talk is full of fantasies, of wishful thinking and make-believe. And these are important to the child. It is here we should be looking to find spontaneous creativity. One common fantasy aspiration of childhood, which can stand for many others, is to fly without wings and by willpower, again the superhero idea, or in the past some kind of spiritual being, demigod or the like. This is a way in which a young child is creative, or proto-creative, wanting to expand his experience, especially in ways that lead to a new quality of experience. Hoping to do something of his own that adds to the world, adds to creation. This lies behind the wish-fulfilling fantasies of being a superhero or a princess, of being unique, special, famous. This isn't merely trivial hedonism or conceit, because to a child such a possibility is creative, important, enlarging and changing the world for the better. It seems to me that, in terms of a young child's world, the meaning of what Jesus Christ made possible lies in the relationship between his understanding of everyday reality, and the world of his wishful thinking and fantasies. The work of Jesus impinged upon the already existing world, to offer a new possible reality, and this unique historical event may be recapitulated in the development of a child. Anyone who was genuinely wholly satisfied with primary creation, with the world as is, would not be interested or attracted by Jesus' possibility of resurrected eternal life in heaven. What such a person wants is to become something like an invulnerable superhero, a Superman, Übermensch, who inhabits this world as it is, but is personally invulnerable to the entropy and evils that are intrinsic to primary creation. Resurrection and heaven are, on the other hand, attractive to those whose childlike daydreams are of a world, that is, a second creation, in which there is only love and no evil in ourselves and all other beings whom we love. A world in which all change is good, the exciting possibility of growing up. What Jesus offers is that instead of only living in this world but becoming invulnerable to its bad things, we can also inhabit a world where we have become all good, there are only loving relationships, and happy daydreams can become reality, with our help. That, in a young child's terms, is approximately what heaven offers, above and beyond the wishes or hopes of pre-Christian and non-Christian understandings. The sweet, silent darkness of no self. Francis Berger. Quote, "Once someone has absorbed the assumptions of mainstream modern materialism, he cannot believe in heaven, and, much worse, he does not even want it to be true." End quote. The above comes from a recent post by Dr. Charlton. I have been ruminating over the idea it contains for weeks, particularly the bit about not wanting heaven to be true. An expressed inability to believe in heaven is one thing, not wanting heaven to be true is another thing altogether. I often wonder what people who dismiss Jesus' offer eternal life as untrue think about when confronted with the idea of heaven. Do they reject it as a fairy tale? A delusion? A carefully crafted method of sociological and political control? Whatever the case, at the core, they must all steadfastly believe in the ultimacy of death. After all, if one cannot believe in heaven, then death has the final say. Materials believe in the recycling of their material in the material world, of their forms dissolving and assuming other forms, but this does not diminish the dominance of death because it annihilates the self in the process. Materialists may kick it up a notch and entertain certain kinds of life after death via reincarnation or such phenomenon. Yet if they can bring themselves to believe in a part of them continuing after death, why is it so difficult to believe in the self continuing in heaven? I posit that it comes down to a lack of awareness about the self. Either that, or an acute awareness that mortifies to the core. Either way, the self is disavowed. It cannot, it must not go on. To think otherwise is unbearable. The self must not continue. It must be obliterated. Or fade away. Or get gently snuffed out like a candle. There is nothing on the other side of crucifix. Only darkness. Sweet, silent, selfless darkness.